Good morning. All right. I am very, very pleased to kick off this presentation. Today, we're going to be in conversation with our Decatur House Advisory Council. Those members are Stephen Hammond, family historian, genealogist, and descendant of Nancy Syphax; Eric Brooks, curator at Henry Clay's Ashland in Kentucky; and Juliana Jackson, historical archaeologist. This conversation will be moderated by Dr. Colleen Shogan, Senior Vice President and Director of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History here at the White House Historical Association. Colleen, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be with you this morning. We're going to be talking about a project that we undertook here at the White House Historical Association and the Rubenstein Center during the pandemic, during COVID. And there was unfortunately many tragedies associated with the pandemic and COVID, but it did give us an opportunity to step back. We weren't, of course, welcoming visitors in person here to Decatur House, and think about our interpretation of Decatur House, particularly the slave quarters, which I know you were able to see yesterday, and think about what stories are we telling at Decatur House when we welcome visitors to Decatur House, when we welcome visitors online to learn more about Decatur House here on Lafayette Square. And how can we improve that interpretation? What are the things that we could do that would be better to more fully tell the stories, the rich history of Decatur House? So we're going to be talking about two parts of that project today, and I know you also saw at least one of the parts of the project yesterday. The three silhouettes of enslaved workers, enslaved people who lived and worked here at Decatur House, and also the architectural renderings that were done to reinterpret that space back to what it would have looked like when enslaved people lived at Decatur House, particularly the 1840s, and we'll talk about why that time period was chosen in particular. And we're going to be in conversation with the Decatur House Advisory Council. Whenever we wanted to do this project, of course, Decatur House is owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The White House Historical Association operates Decatur House in conjunction and partnership with the National Trust. And we benefited from a grant from the National Trust to do this work. And when we were moving forward, we wanted to get external advisors from across the country who would be able to help us in doing this work to make sure, as always, when you bring in people who have a separate set of eyes, different set of expertise than what you have, what you do is always improved for both comprehensiveness and also for accuracy. And we're joined here today by the three members of that panel, of that council that assisted us through these two phases of this project. So you're very lucky to be able to hear from them today. They're going to tell these stories in their own words and talk to you about the expertise that they brought to this project and really made it the resounding success that it was. So we're very happy to be joined with them today. So I just want to start out with an introductory question. I think all of us here on the stage and all of us here in this room, we really enjoy learning about American history, and we work in the fields of American history. So I'll start, we'll just go down the row, start with you, Juliana. What brought you to studying and working in the field of history? What ignited your interest? For me, it was when I was a junior in high school, and I had a really terrific teacher, actually, that taught perspectives of United States history. That's when I started really getting interested in the subject. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, of course. So I think kind of that spark for me was going on hikes and walks with my dad. I grew up in Baltimore County. Throughout the Loch Raven Reservoir, there are remnants of blast furnaces and structures from people who lived during the 18th, 19th century, and just encountering those structures, being curious about the people who used them, lived in them, really drove me to ask some more questions. And then going into high school, loved history, art history, and then in college is when I discovered that I could be an archaeologist for a career. And so really digging down into a different level of those structures, unearthing artifacts, and using that material culture, the things that people left behind, to get a clearer picture of their lives and understand their stories was what was really exciting and inspiring for me.
Eric?
I don't know that I have one specific experience, but like Juliana, growing up, my parents regularly took me to museums and historic sites, and we'd go on vacation, and they'd always ask my sister and I what we wanted to do. She always wanted to go to an amusement park or the beach or whatever, and I always wanted to go to museums and historic sites. And we usually worked out a compromise and did both, which meant that I got to spend about half the time I would have liked to spend in the museum, but I at least got to go, and that fostered a great interest in history. That said, growing up, I think I always thought that I would be an Egyptologist, and sort of started a career that I thought would lead there, but fate had other plans. When I graduated from undergraduate school, this job was 30 years ago this summer, I was hired as a ranger on the National Mall. And so I worked for about 6 months running the then 4 monuments. There are now, 8 or 9 that were there on the mall. And that began a career in history, and in U.S. history specifically. I followed that with a year at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, which is the home of Theodore Roosevelt on Long Island. So by that time, I had developed a pretty significant body of experience in U.S. history. And although I still had perhaps beliefs or delusions, depending on whose perspective we were using, that I would be an Egyptologist, I think it became pretty clear by the time I got most of the way through grad school that there were more opportunities, and it was more likely that I was going to proceed with a career in U.S. history. And so my first job out of grad school was at a small historic site in Frankfort, Kentucky. And then after 4 years there, I was able to come home to Lexington and assume the curatorship at Ashland, where I've been for the last 20 years. So this has become not just an interest or a passing fancy, but my life's work. And it's work that I've enjoyed immensely, and I'm glad to be able to continue to do.
Steve?
Good morning. Glad to be here with you all. So my story really is about how I got interested in family history and genealogy. And you saw at the beginning of that slide, my family tree, and the person at the top, that was Margaret Syphax, and her mother was Nancy Syphax, which is the woman that you all probably saw yesterday. And so for me, as a young middle schooler, I had an opportunity to interact with cousins of my mother, and I'll show you a picture of this cousin who really impacted me in just a minute. But it got me interested in terms of what do I know about my parents? What do I know about my grandparents? And I started to kind of poke around in my mom's hope chest. And I started to look at the things that my father had, and over the course of years, I've been able to find a number of artifacts, and those are the things that you see here. And one of the ones that really sticks out to me on this list is that last one there, where it talks about February 14th, 1966. That is a notes from our family meeting. How many people had family meetings? Not too many, but our family had a meeting every week. And my brother and I were responsible for doing certain things. And this particular one, my brother says, "We will never get anything done." How about that? So these things were things that kind of got me, that kind of drew me into wanting to know more about my history. Let's go to the next slide. The person on the left is Estrelda Gray. She is a first cousin once removed, and when I was kind of in 7th or 8th grade in Denver, Colorado, we went to church together. And after church, we would go to her home, and we would talk, and she would start to tell me about our family history. I would steal away into her library, which is a small house, but into second bedroom, which she had turned into a library. Books on all the walls. And there was lots of geology books there, which I became a geologist. So she had a large impact on me, but she also told me that, "Steve, did you know that you were that we're related to the first president of the United States?" I said, as a 7th grader, I'm saying, get out of here. I'm a black kid in Denver. How do I have any relationship to the President of the United States? And so it got me thinking about how do I figure out fact from fiction from folklore, And so I've been on this journey for 50 plus years, which is pretty amazing. The other thing that she told me in that space was, you need to know who your relatives are. They're all over the place, and it's your job to try to help keep your family together. So that left me with a really strong desire to understand my history and then connect us all together. The person on the right, that is Evelyn Syphax, and she lived here in the Washington, D.C. area over in Arlington, and she introduced me to our Syphax family members that were here in the area when I moved here for the first time. And so these two women really had a large impact on my life in terms of how I kind of kept me interested in wanting to learn more. Let's go to the next slide. So the reasons that I do this are to seek truth, to honor my family, to expand my own knowledge, but also to help educate and inspire others, as we're talking about this in this space, and then share the narrative of this family. When we think about Nancy being up there I'm already getting choked up about this. When you think about Nancy being up in that space and what her life must have been like, but nobody really knows much about her. How do we share that story, not only amongst our family, but with teachers and students and people who need to understand the fabric of this country? So those things were really important to me. Let's go to the next slide. So as a part of this whole thing, as we talked about what my cousin Estrelda basically taught me was you need to know where your family is. Well, what I figured out is the Syphaxes are part of what I'm calling the Syphax Scenic Byway. It's a 13-mile stretch that runs from Washington, D.C. to Mount Vernon. And it also says something about how African American families are distributed, are separated, are in different places. Nancy was here. Her brother was actually enslaved over at not the Decatur House, but at Arlington National Cemetery, the Arlington House, which was owned by George Washington Parke Custis. But you can see from this list all the places that are really amazing. Somebody was asking me, what should we see while we're here? Well, there's also the Syphax School, which is here in Southwest Washington, D.C. That was named after one of my distant cousins for the fact that he helped to start the black public schools here in Washington, D.C. He helped to establish the first high school for blacks here in Washington, D.C. It's an amazing story that we just need to dig into and tell more clearly. Let's go to the next slide. So this is one that really, as I'm trying to figure out fact from fiction from folklore, this is one that really struck me. And I've worked for years to try to get the Park Service to put this family tree together, which I'm really proud of that they've done. But I mentioned Nancy, who's here. Charles, who was her brother, actually married a woman who was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis. And if you don't know your history, George Washington Parke Custis was the grandson of Martha Washington. So all of this line of Syphaxes are connected to the first family, to Martha Washington to be specific. And so it's pretty amazing to be able to now tell this story and do it more clearly and to provide information that most people know that George Washington Parke Custis' other daughter married, wait for it, Robert E. Lee. So we have these families, one enslaved, one free, on completely different trajectories. So all of these things have been of interest to me as I think about why do I tell my story, what got me interested in history, and I work to try to find nuggets that help to draw other people into that.
So Steve, we'll start with you. Your third great grandmother is Nancy Syphax, and she was one of the people who lived here at Decatur House that was chosen to be portrayed in one of the silhouettes. Can you tell us a little bit about, as much as you know about Nancy, and tell us how you learned about Nancy and your trajectory, your journey?
Sure. Let's go to the next slide there. So you saw Margaret Syphax at the top of my family tree, and I'll come back to her in just a minute. But the way we learned that Nancy was here is one of my Syphax cousins was actually here at the house for some kind of function. and they had posted John Gatsby's inventory of his house. And in that inventory, Nancy Syphax. He owned Nancy Syphax. So that was a tip-off for us. But we also knew that the Syphaxes were in Alexandria and at Mount Vernon, and we were able to kind of start to put together some pieces that showed that John Gatsby, who owned this house at the time, he also owned the Gatsby Tavern in Alexandria. And the Gatsby Tavern in Alexandria was 2 blocks from where Nancy's father lived at the Carlisle House. And so there's an intertwined history here that really is amazing. We don't have a lot of hard documentation. That's part of the challenge of telling our history. But we can learn from this that Nancy spent time here. After Gatsby died, he basically, his wife inherited Nancy. And when Providence Gatsby died, she basically willed Nancy to her daughter, Augusta McBlair. And so we've kind of been able to kind of trace Nancy's movements through the works of other people. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about this in a moment, but there's Nancy, who's ironing upstairs. And the thing that strikes me about this, we'll talk about it more in a few minutes, is I wonder what Nancy's thinking about there. She's ironing, but she's also, her mind is somewhere else. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the very interesting things about Nancy, and I think you all kind of know this already, is that she was involved in the Compensated Emancipation Act. So I'm going to ask you, how many people were aware of the Emancipated Compensation Act before you were here? Not, okay, Clint? How many of you are aware of it now? Is that amazing or what? We in this country have had an act to compensate people for owning people. And yet our ability to talk about reparation is kind of taboo in this country. People don't want to go there. But we've already done it in a lot of different ways. So the documents that you see here, there are 2 of them. The one on the left is a petition that Augusta McBlair basically filed with the Commission of the United States after that law was passed. And so people who owned people here in the district could basically petition to be compensated for the loss of their enslaved workers. And so you can see on this list, Nancy Syphax is number 4 on that list. And Augusta McBlair put all these really nice things in there about Nancy, saying that she was a great nurse and that she was a laundress and she did all these other things, and they listed her for worth a value of $800. $800. She put in this petition, and the commissioners on the petition basically looked at all of the people here. They had about $1 million to distribute. $1 million in 1862. Only for Washington, D.C. When they looked at Augusta McBlair's petition, they looked at the people there, and look what they paid her for Nancy. What's the number? Say it out loud.
$87.60.
So somebody places a value on somebody for $800, and they are compensated for about 1/10 of that. That's what Nancy's value was considered to be in the city in 1862. So we've been able to trace Nancy. The interesting thing about this is Nancy's free. That's a good thing, right? Augusta McBlair is compensated. And so there's a win-win aspect of this in terms of what's going on here. The interesting thing about this is that Nancy continues to live with the McBlairs even after she is freed. And why do you think that is? Not a lot of other skills. She's older.
Is it kind of like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know kind of thing?
That could very well be the case. But a part of it is, where does she go? Now, there were a lot of other Syphaxes in the city. The fact that she was an urban enslaved woman, I think that her life was different than if she was out, on a plantation outside the city. So she was able to move around. I think she was able to go to church, and she probably had a chance to actually interact with her family members. But she was owned by Augusta McBlair. She always went home to that place. So let's go to the next slide. We find Nancy in the 1870 census. This is the first census in which people who were enslaved are now shown by name after the Civil War. And you can see here, down at the bottom, very bottom with the arrow, Nancy Syphax. And she's listed at, I believe it's 79 years old. 79. So if we back that up to 1862, she's in her 70s, right? Where is she going to go? What is she going to do? What does her life look like? How does she decide what it means to be free? She continued to work for the McBlairs. Whether or not she was compensated for that work, or whether she simply had a house, a roof over her head and a bed, is unclear to us. But she spent the rest of her days working for the McBlairs, and we're still looking for the place. We believe we know where she's buried, but we're still looking for that to kind of determine that. I think that's. Can you go to the next slide, Samantha, and we'll see if. I'll come back to that. Let's go back one slide, and then you can ask your next question.
Well, Steve, I mean, it must have been, I can't even imagine the emotions that you must have felt when you saw Nancy Syphax depicted in that silhouette. Can you tell us a little bit more about that process and maybe of your connection to that and how some decisions were made about that silhouette? Too?
Right. Well, first of all, I was honored to be asked to be a part of this panel, this council that we all sit on. Going back to what Estrelda has said, you need to know who your people are. Raise the narrative. So what better way to do that than having an opportunity to be with other very skilled people to tell that story? So that's the first piece. But then it came, how do we depict Nancy? We don't have any pictures of Nancy. How do we go from not knowing what she looked like or might have been thinking to something that we can share with people who for maybe 10 minutes walk into that space and they have a chance to put a person with a picture? It's not easy to do, especially when it's a two-dimensional picture. And so, let's go to the next slide. So you remember the picture that I showed you just a couple of slides ago that showed me holding the tintype photo of Margaret, her daughter. So that was in my head as we started to think about how do we put Nancy into this picture. So we tried to take some things from that picture, like the bonnet that she had on and kind of her stature. She had a very narrow waist. Margaret had a narrow waist. This shows Nancy with a relatively narrow waist. But I also, in my mind, wanted to connect her with other things that I knew. And one of the other things that we had was this letter that was written to Nancy in 1857 by her grandson from New Orleans. Nancy's daughter, who we believe was born in about 1818, was actually sold, more than likely around the early 1830s. Could have been right out here, or it could have been by Armfield and Franklin, or one of those folks that were dealing in slaves and trying to move people from the north to the south. At the very least, we know that Margaret ended up in New Orleans, and she had a son named Peter Joseph in 1862. Peter in 1857 writes this letter to Nancy. And there are things in there that talks about, hey, I long to see you. I long to be with you. And he talks about who his brothers and sisters are. I feel very connected to Nancy. And I want people that go up into the room there to be connected to Nancy. And how we do that and how we depict that in the pictures that we put together and how we reenact the spaces that they lived in. Help draw you and students into that space so that perhaps for just a few minutes you can sense for what they had to deal with in this space. And so that's how we began to put this together.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing that. I think I will just comment. I'm the director of the Rubenstein Center, and some of the people that I work with are the historians here at Decatur House. And when we entered into this work, we really felt like this was some of the most important work we would do particularly during COVID, during the pandemic, because of the reasons that Steve, just described and talked to you about. And for me personally, I never walk past the slave quarters when I go up to our offices, which are on the 3rd floor, without now in my mind, I have, now in my mind I have these stories, and I also have these silhouettes that I think do help. Can't do everything. It's not anything that we can do to take back history, but at least we've returned some humanity to the people who lived and worked in Decatur House. So Juliana, we're going to come to you next, and your help in this project in particular was to help us with the architectural renderings that were done to reinterpret the slave quarters and give us some depictions of what it might have looked like, particularly in the 1840s. So can you tell us how you approached this project, some of your work in Octagon House, which is nearby, and what were some of the decisions that were made to help bring this space to life?
Yes, of course. So in archaeology, context is everything. And so when starting on a research project, when asking a question, it's kind of one of the first things you look to build is what is the context? What did the city look like at the time? What was the population like? What was the scene? And my background, my research was focused on the Octagon House, not far from here, in DC, and looking at contexts of slavery within the urban setting. In very early Washington, the Octagon House began construction in 1799 and was completed in 1802. And comparing that with a more rural plantation setting. And so the tools that I used in understanding what was life like for the enslaved people living at the Octagon House, living at Decatur House at any given moment in time, were using maps, using letters. Steve mentioned inventories, probate inventories, any kind of records that were left behind, and then also archaeological investigations that were undertaken, what were the kind of materials that were recovered. I know for this project, dendrochronology was used to really understand when were things being constructed, how were they constructed, but also at the same time, also really keeping in mind what is the lens that we're looking at this information through, whose voice are we listening to? And I think the next slide shows an example of one of the documents that I used when conducting my own research, which is from John Tayloe, the owner of the Octagon House, to his architect, William Lovering. And so the letter just goes through, his concerns about the construction, his desires for completing it. But one of the things that I have to keep in mind when we're listening to this voice, hearing this voice, yes, it's very important for understanding the timeline, understanding the construction, but it's just one voice. When John Tayloe died in 1828, there were almost 700 people that his family enslaved. And so one voice out of over 700, it's really important to also dig a little bit deeper, use other ways to uncover what life was like for people like Nancy, like James, like Charlotte, who were living at Decatur House at the time. So really digging a little bit deeper, using things like paintings that were depicting enslaved life. There's a painter, Eastman Johnson, who painted in the late 1850s some scenes from Mount Vernon, also a scene that's attributed to Washington, D.C. So looking at what was the architecture like? What were the materials? Was pottery, different types of implements that would fill out someone's life in the 1840s. And so, again, keeping in mind the lens, the voice, but also using that to create a better picture of what life would have been like for Nancy, Charlotte, James, who didn't always have the benefit of having their voice recorded. And so that was a huge responsibility and really rewarding to be able to create that fuller picture with those various records.
So tell us a little bit more into specifics, because it's like you're a history detective, and I find that this aspect of it fascinating. But tell us some of the things that you knew, so decisions that were made in those architectural renderings, but then tell us about things that we just maybe lost history that we don't know, and how do you, when you determine that you don't know something, how do you deal with that in when you're depicting something in a architectural rendering or a a visual display?
Sure, and so that is a big challenge, but we do know that, yes, these were spaces that were functional spaces, but they were also multi-purpose spaces. We know that Nancy was living here full time. Yes, she had duties as a laundress, but she also ate her meals in these spaces. She relaxed in these spaces. So I think that was something that was really, knowing the different uses for that space was very important for us to communicate. So we had information, including the bed, communicating that it wasn't just a utilitarian space, that this was a space where people's lives played out. In more urban settings, enslaved people, they had a little bit more liberty in terms of being able to build a community. We know that Nancy had family in DC, so just being able to communicate that this space was more than just a task that was imposed on someone. Having the bed, the chair to sit by the fire. From my work at the Octagon House, I know that they recovered items like needles and different pieces of ceramics, and so that builds a fuller picture of how these spaces were used. Was there, we could ask, was there mending being done, a sewing project, someone sitting with a cup of tea, all of those questions. And I think the beauty of these renderings is that it starts that conversation and it sparks that inquiry into what were all the different ways that these spaces were used.
Eric, tell us more about the story of Charlotte Dupuy, who is also another individual who's portrayed in one of the three silhouettes. So tell us about her.
Sure. Charlotte Dupuy was one of the now approximately 120 people whose names we know who were enslaved by Henry Clay and his family at Ashland. Her story actually starts not far from here. She was born in Cambridge, Maryland. Next slide, please. On the farm of a man named Daniel Parker. Her family was enslaved there. When she was 5, her father, and you can see the document on the left over there, purchased the freedom of her mother, Rachel, and her 2 siblings. Her father, George, bought her mother's freedom immediately and her children's freedom over time. The daughter would be freed, her sister, Lottie's sister, would be freed at the age of 16, and the son at the age of 21. And I think they were probably, at that point, 7 or 8 and 9 or 10, something like that. So this was down the line. Now, for reasons of which we are not clear, Charlotte's freedom was not purchased. We don't know if that was because George couldn't afford it. Daniel Parker wouldn't sell. We don't know what the reason was for that. But this begins a process of separation that will eventually completely separate Lottie from her family. When she is 8, she is purchased by a man named James Condon. Condon buys her from Parker. He is a tailor. He lives in town in Cambridge, Maryland. She goes to his tailor shop to work in the tailor shop and lives in his tailor building. At that point, she is separated from her family by virtue of the fact that she is now not living with them for sure. She probably still sees them regularly. They're still living in the same general area. So the separation is not total, but that will not last. By the time she is 18, Condon will move to Lexington, Kentucky, 600 miles away, where he sells Charlotte to Henry Clay. He takes her there in some part because she represents his most valuable asset financially. And he sells her to build his business. So he sells her to Clay. She comes to live with Clay and his family. And around that time, she meets Aaron Dupuy, she's met Aaron Dupuy, who is also enslaved by Clay. They marry. She convinces Henry Clay to make this purchase so that they can be together and so that she can begin building a life with perhaps less fear of further separation. It's a remarkable act for someone, given her age and all, that she is able to do this. But she convinces Clay to buy her. She goes to live with Clay and Aaron. They have 2 children, Charles and Mary Ann. And probably within a year or 2 of her purchase, they move to Ashland. By that time, he will have built the farm and bought the farm and began building it, and probably they are living there at that point. Next slide, please. Now, this is Aaron, Charlotte's husband. This picture is probably from the 1850s. It's a photograph showing him in livery. He was the carriage driver and for a long time Henry Clay's valet, so that clothing is designed to show off the wealth of the family. It is not designed particularly for his purposes or benefit. They're showing this because of what they want to show about the Clay family. We don't know when or where it was taken. The drawing is her son Charles. We actually own this in the collection at Ashland. It's a relatively recent acquisition, and it's a remarkable artifact. The artist drew it at Ashland in the drawing room on November 20th, 1842. The fact that we know that is astounding. You rarely, for any artifact in the collection, have that level of specificity. I interpret this about 15, 20 feet from where it was drawn. That is amazing. And the further amazing part of this is that the guy who drew it did it because he wanted to capture Aaron, because he was somebody he wanted to remember. This was meant for the artist's personal portfolio. It was never meant to be publicly consumed. So there's nothing here that's meant to distort that image. There's nothing here that is meant to denigrate Charles or say anything about the people who enslaved him. What you see is this human being, and that, I think, is truly incredible. So we have a few images of her family. Next slide. This is the really most fascinating part of Lottie's story, and this is the part that happens when she's here. So Henry Clay becomes Secretary of State in 1825 under John Quincy Adams. 2 years later, he moves into and rents Decatur House for himself and his family. His wife, I think they had 1 child living with them at the time. They were visited by numerous grandchildren. They bring to Washington in 1825 Lottie and her 2 children. Now, her husband remains in Kentucky. He is with Henry Clay's brother and is hired out to others to work. So Lottie and her husband are separated during this period. So for 4 years, while she's here, he's not. But she learns something very important when she gets here. She meets a number of free African Americans and other enslaved African Americans in Washington and visits her family, and in this process learns that there have been a number of suits filed by African Americans in this area seeking their freedom from those who enslaved them. And further, that a goodly percentage of those are actually successful. We now know, the records now show that about 51% of the time the enslaved person won the suit. And that's pretty amazing. That's really a pretty remarkable record. So she decides she's going to sue for her freedom and that of her children. She sees an opportunity and she's going to take it. She times that very deliberately The document on the left over there is the petition for suit, which is filed in mid-February of 1829. That's not an accident. She knows that in 2 weeks after that is filed, Clay will leave the office of Secretary of State and return to Kentucky. She also knows that when he does, the courts will not allow him to take Charlotte home. She will be forced to stay here until the trial is adjudicated. That's what happens. She stays here at Decatur House in the employ of Martin Van Buren, who follows Clay as Secretary of State and moves into the property during that term. This is thoroughly investigated. This document sends 2 men to Tennessee to interview James Condon, who is living in Nashville at this point. They want to get his story on his interactions with Charlotte and the sale to Henry Clay. So they spend a year investigating this matter. Finally, on May 30th, or about May 30th of 1830, May of 1830, the trial is held in the D.C. Circuit Courthouse, which is over in Judiciary Square. It's still there. Unfortunately for Lottie, she is found not to have a cause for freedom for herself or for her children. At that point, the trial having concluded in Clay's favor, he orders her back to Ashland. Lottie refuses to come. He has her jailed across the river in Alexandria and eventually put on a ship to New Orleans. Clay has a son-in-law with 2 grandsons who are living there and a daughter and son-in-law who have several children there as well. So she goes to their residences and is there about 3 years. So in toto, when it's all said and done, she is separated from her husband for 8 years and from her children for about 3.5, almost 4 years. So she spends a lot of time apart from her family because of the choice she makes. I think it's probably a choice that inspired more people to do what she did. The fact that she sued one of the most famous and powerful people in the country was tremendously powerful, tremendously inspiring in its own right. Next slide, please. Now, Lottie was emancipated in 1840 along with her daughter Mary Ann, and the terms of this, this is from the Fayette County Clerk's office in Fayette County, Lexington, Kentucky. It says that she is emancipated for long and faithful service. So they become free. Now, it also says unequivocally that none of Mary Ann's or Lottie's children are free. This is very important, and this is a direct result of the lawsuit. So they do not become emancipated. Eventually, Mary Ann is emancipated. Charles is not. Eventually, Charles is emancipated, but Aaron never is. Next slide, please. Now, we have, and you will see momentarily, the silhouette of Lottie. We came very close to having a photograph. I wish I knew where it was. This partly was used in considering the silhouette. Now, this is from long after her time at Decatur House. By the time this happens, it's 1855. She has been free for 15 years. This comes from a letter at the Library of Congress written by Henry Clay's daughter-in-law, Susan, to one of her siblings. And in it, she says to her sister, Lucy, "I have a new photograph of Mammy Lottie, Tommy, and Susie. Don't you wish you could see it? Mammy, I assure you, looked her best. She tried on 2 dresses before she could suit herself, and at last had the good taste to wear her black silk she bought in Europe, and with the collar Miss Kate gave her, and the new head handkerchief she got in New York. I assure you, we all felt very proud of her. She deserves to be thus handed down to posterity, for she has been far more useful in her generation than many who are above her in station and whiter of skin, and her likeness deserves to be prized by my children." That's an amazing passage, and it says a lot about Lottie. Here's a woman who's been free for 15 years, who has become extremely confident in her identity and is taking pains to ensure that it is preserved in a certain way, that when people see this photograph, they see what she wants them to see, not what her former enslavers do. I think that's remarkable. I wish, like I say, I knew where it was. I don't. I have looked a lot. In fact, yesterday I was at the Library of Congress. There's a small collection of family photos assembled by Susan's children and grandchildren that are there. None of them are of Lottie. I have checked with the family. I know most of the descendants that are now around of Susan's and James's, Henry Clay's son James. I have not yet found the photo. That doesn't mean that I might not. It might appear, but at present we don't know where it is located. And the end of this story is still being researched. So Next slide, please. We know that, you see at the bottom, this is from the 1860 census. This is in Lexington. Aaron and Charlotte are living with this man named Joseph Coleman. We know almost nothing about Coleman. We don't know how they knew him. We don't really know who he was. We know he was a whitewasher. That's about it. He's 50. They're in their 70s. You see this name at the bottom. That's William Dupuy. We think he's a grandson, a son of Charles Dupuy. I think, he worked for Coleman. They were both whitewashers. That would make sense. So I think he probably invited his grandparents to live at their residence since he was working for Mr. Coleman. But beyond that, we don't know. When Aaron died in 1866, his obituary shows that he is survived by his daughter Mary Ann, his wife Charlotte, and their grandchildren, but not by his son Charles. We think Charles must have died by then for some reason. We don't know why. Now, we know when Aaron died, we know where he was buried in Lexington. We know where he may now be buried. The cemetery where he was buried was closed and sold for development in the 1870s. And his body moved. Unfortunately, it was interred in a mass grave, and the tombstone was lost. So I don't know for sure exactly where it is, but I'm pretty sure the cemetery it's in. But for Lottie and for Mary Ann and for Charles, we don't know when or where they died or how or where they are buried. I hope someday we will. It was a fascinating and incredibly important story. If you want to know more about freedom trials, there is this book called A Question of Freedom, which just came out about a year ago or so, which contains a really great study of the freedom trials. And there's a website, I believe it's earlydchistory.org, where you can source all of these documents. The 2 documents I showed you come from images I got from that website. So well worth a look.
Thank you, Eric. We're going to have a few more questions here, but then we're going to turn to you. We will turn to you for a full half hour of questions. So if you have things that you would like answered, please, we will have plenty of time for that. I wanted to ask you 3. So, in addition to this work that's been, done at Decatur House, what other types of activities or research do you think should be undertaken here or other places in this area to help our understanding of the history of enslavement in the United States, and particularly the history of slavery in Washington, D.C. and the area around the White House and President's Park? What else should be done? Anybody?
I'm involved with a couple of other organizations with regard to descendant families. I'm involved with what I'm calling a family circle associated with descendants of the Arlington House, and we're currently working on several activities there. One of which is to change the name of the Arlington House, which is now the Arlington House, the Robert E. Lee Memorial, and legislation was just introduced here in the last 2 weeks in both the House and the Senate, which will change the name from the Robert E. Lee Memorial to Arlington House National Historic Site, which is intended to raise up and be more inclusive of all of the lives that were there. So part of the answer to your question is we can do more to understand our collective histories. We're now working on an ethnohistory of all of those that were enslaved and who worked there. This doesn't diminish the Lees. We have a lot of Lees that are a part of this family circle, which I'm really proud of. But we're working to try to raise up everybody and better understand what's going on. Similarly, I'm involved in a relatively new descendants community at Mount Vernon. How many people have visited Mount Vernon? So a number of you have. In the last year and a half, we've established what we are calling ourselves as the League of Descendants of the Enslaved at Mount Vernon. We started with about 15 people, we're now about 60. Many of these people are finding us because they have heard the folklore that there's a connection, but they don't know how. And so one of the goals that we have for ourselves is to help each other learn more about our connectiveness. One of our goals is to work with the ladies of Mount Vernon, whose goals at Mount Vernon are to tell the story of George Washington in 1799. We're trying to do things that will help them see beyond that space so that the millions of people who come to visit that space have a better appreciation of what that space means. If you've seen that cartoon that they have of the number of enslaved people and the number of free white people, talking about that this morning, it's like 11 and 300, right? It was a black community. How do we help them do that? We're looking at helping Mount Vernon. They've acquired a property which was a part of Union Farm, and they're now beginning to do some archaeological work down there. And so our goal is to be in on this at the early part of it, not afterwards and say, hey, tell us what you think, but to be at the front end of this as we're talking about how do we explore this space and how do we help bring the things that we find to the public. And I'm hoping to activities like these, I was talking about the scenic byway. You maybe can see how things are all kind of interwoven here. How do we use this space to help the public better understand? When you come to visit, it's not just about coming to Decatur House. It's not just about going to Mount Vernon. It's about seeing all of this space as a collective, as a connective tissue.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just building off of what Steve mentioned, space and place is so important to understanding history. And I think what's really great about this project is raising these voices, lifting up these stories, and having more of these conversations in different spaces. A lot of times when you're walking through an urban space like DC, you might not be thinking this was a space where a lot of people were enslaved and living and working. And I think interpreting those stories is very, very important. I think we are all able to be practitioners of history in different ways. I think having the conversations, asking the questions, these stories are not finished, like Eric was saying. There's always more to uncover, and I think keeping that dialogue going is really important.
I agree with all of those things, and we are doing a lot of work at Ashland of this sort. We're trying to build a descendant community. I'm working with several folks now. I hope that I will be working with more in the future. Certainly, I would love to find descendants of Aaron and Lottie, which so far I have not. But hopefully at some point we will do that. We continue to do research. I will be spending the rest of this week at the Library of Congress in the Henry Clay Family Papers. I will not finish going through those papers. There are approximately 18,000 documents in that collection, but I'm going to try to look at ones in targeted areas where I know there is likely to be information about the enslaved community and where there's going to be information that fits gaps in the story or that relates to particular things that we are interested in at this moment. But there is a lot more research that needs to be done. We are trying to find new ways to present that information, and I think presentation is critical. It's only modestly valuable to do the research if it goes in a file and never is brought forth to light and used to broaden people's minds and perspectives. We have a tour at Ashland now called Traces Slavery at Ashland, which looks at the estate from the perspective of the enslaved, including Aaron and Lottie. And in fact, the Dupuis story binds that tour together. We do that tour every day at 1 o'clock. I do that tour every Tuesday, except this Tuesday, obviously. So
We're still
anyway,
waiting for you there.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so we're trying to do things like that. We want to put this story out there. Just yesterday, like I said, I went to Judiciary Square to see the building where Lottie's trial took place. That building still stands. That building is now 202 years old. It's a beautiful structure, but there's nothing there that tells you anything about that happening. And it's not just about Lottie. I mean, certainly that's a cool story and there's a lot known about it, so you could put that as part of a text, but it wasn't the only trial. When you look at the book and the website, there were a lot of these trials, and many of them probably took place in that building. How powerful and important would it be to have some sort of marker or something in front of that building that says, here there were trials wherein enslaved people sued their enslavers for their freedom or the freedom of loved ones? How much would that mean to people whose ancestors may have brought those suits, who maybe didn't know that, who could then say, wow, I should do some research. Maybe I can find something about my ancestor this way. We have a duty to that. We have an obligation to that. And so we need to do that. We didn't.
Oh, we didn't see the silhouette.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
there we
silhouette
go.
of Lottie. This goes to this silhouette a little bit. We had a lot of talk about Lottie because while we know she took care of children, Henry Clay had a lot of his grandchildren visit while he was here. She would have taken care of them, and I think they had their youngest child, John, here for a while. She also was a cook. Those are all important things. We could have had her carrying a platter. In fact, at one point, I think we actually had a version that had her carrying a platter with a turkey or something like that. But the thing to me that separates her story or makes her story unique is the suit. And I wanted to capture something in the silhouette that says this is what she did. So that's why she's holding the paper. Now, that could be any sort of paper, but that's the goal here, is to communicate that she engaged in this action from this location.
Okay, so I think we should turn it over to our teachers here in attendance, who I'm sure have all kinds of comments and questions. We're over here and then here. If you say your question, then I'm going to repeat it for the camera. The question is about Ashland, and what is Ashland doing, like other sites such as Monticello and Mount Vernon, to integrate the stories of slavery into the experience of people who visit there?
We're doing quite a lot. I mean, it's something that is at the fore of everything that we do at this time. We have created the Traces Tour. We are working to build a descendant community. We continue to do archaeology in the slave quarters area. We've done some, we're doing more. We hope that that will provide us with better understanding of where those buildings were, what happened there, exactly how they were laid out, et cetera. We don't have a standing structure. In fact, that building is the only building that I know of for sure that still stands where any of the enslaved people that Clay enslaved actually lived. So we're working on that. We are working on an exhibit that will go into an outbuilding that will continue to tell these stories. It'd be a place where when we find stories, we can add them and make them available. We're trying to put materials on the website. We're looking at ways to memorialize the enslaved. So like I say, it is a major part of the things that we are doing right now. We have revised our signature tour to better include the perspective of the enslaved in that. We're trying to expand it beyond just the traces to all aspects of what we do at Ashland. So it's incredibly important, and it's, like I say, a major focus of the things we're doing and of what I'm doing. I spend a significant amount of my time right now working on this area, and I intend to continue to do that wherever I can.
It's over here. So the question is that there's gaps in the research, and everybody's talked about that. And is that just lost history because of those gaps, or was actually evidence destroyed in order to hide some of these stories?
In the case of Ashland, that's a good question. Some of it is probably lost and there to be found. I think the photograph is an evidence of that, because until 2020, maybe 2021, we didn't know about that. That was found by a researcher writing a book on historic preservation and historic real estate in the early Republic. She did a whole section on when Henry Clay's son James tore down his father's house and rebuilt it, which is a fascinating story beyond the scope of this particular meeting, but it's a really neat book. And she just happened to find this letter in a particular file in the Henry Clay family papers. And fortunately, she is also a scholar. The woman who found this, who was a professor at Villanova, is also a scholar of historic photography and daguerreotypes in particular. So it resonated with her. She put it in her book. I found it there. I've taken up the quest of looking for the photograph. So that's a case where there was history there that has been saved. We just have to dig it out, tease it out, and put it front and center where it can be seen. Now, to be honest, I do think that the Henry Clay papers have been edited by the family over the years. I think there are things that they either didn't think were important or desired not to preserve. I don't think there's much question of that. I think when you look at the history of the interpretation of the site, especially in its earliest years, and Ashland has been open to the public since 1950, and it opened to the public shortly after the death of Henry Clay's great-granddaughter who lived at the estate. Her son had a life estate. So I think in those early years, certainly there was no desire to tell the story of slavery, and it wasn't told. And that the fact that we don't have the slave quarters is perhaps the result of the reality that people making decisions about preservation didn't see those as worth preserving or a story that they necessarily wanted to talk a lot about. Unlike some of the other outbuildings that we have, which they thought were more important. That's unfortunate. I wish they had saved at least one or two of them. We have to deal with the reality that we have, not the reality we would like. So we're working to do that in the best way possible. So yes, it's both stuff that's been removed or deleted, it's also stuff that's just there and hasn't been recovered in a way that it's then been brought forward.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Steve.
I'll just piggyback on that for just a second, and that is, if you look at the inventory that we use from John Gatsby's will, one of the themes that I would have here is what's missing. Somebody chose to write down the things that were in that inventory. But when you look at the room where people likely would have lived, did it capture everything? No, it didn't. And so as we think about inspecting these spaces, I think it's really important for us to ask ourselves, to remember to ask ourselves, what's missing from this space? If you dream just a little bit about what normal people would have had in their lives, what else would have been in that space? So that, as we think about inventories and we think about the papers that are there, those were written primarily by white people who were talking about a white space.
The hardest,
So how can we look at that through a different lens?
the hardest information to find is information about enslavement from the perspective of the people who experienced it.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's fine to go find something like we have the photograph of Lottie. That's great. That's really important. But to have statements about slavery at Ashland from those who experienced it, that's the hardest stuff to find. Now, we do currently have two. One is from a slave narrative of a boy who, along with his brother, was taken from his home in New Jersey to Kentucky, where he was enslaved across the street from Ashland, and later by a friend of Henry Clay. So he visited the estate, knew some of the people enslaved there, and wrote about things that he learned and saw when he was enslaved. Well, dictated those things to someone else who wrote them. That book is called The Kidnapped and the Ransomed, and it's the life of Peter Still. You can find it online. It's out of print, but you can find copies if you wish to read it. Fascinating document. If you've never read a slave narrative, there is no better way to understand slavery than to read that kind of document. 12 Years a Slave starts here in Washington. That is a powerful story. If you've never seen the movie or read the book, highly recommend it.
We'll talk about that later with Paul Jennings, who was an enslaved person who worked in the White House, and that's one of the few slave narratives that we do have, and that's why that's very important for us. Later on, we'll tell some of those stories and how he gives us more information about some of the things that happened at the White House that maybe contradicts other people's versions of what happened.
Yeah.
The most detailed account we have of slavery at Ashland from someone who was enslaved is from a man who was a freedom seeker on the Underground Railroad and escaped to Canada. And when they found out that he had escaped from Ashland and from Henry Clay, they said, "You need to speak about this. We can pull the curtain back on this man who's made all sorts of statements about how he handles the enslaved at Ashland. Now you can tell the truth." And he did, and it was written down and published in abolitionist papers first, and then I think to some degree in more mainstream papers because it was about Henry Clay. So that's a great story. That's a great document because it gives us some really concrete information about daily life and the things they experienced and why he escaped to freedom. So that, I think, is on our website, henryclay.org. There's a section about the enslaved at Ashland there, and it's a major part of our Traces tour. We actually had an actor in Lexington record that. So we play an audio of that, the whole thing, for the people who take the tour.
Leanna, did you have anything to add, or do you?
I would just echo what both of my colleagues said, which is throughout history there were always strategic decisions made about how things were curated, what materials were kept for posterity, what buildings were preserved, even how buildings were built, you know. So that's always something to keep in mind when researching, is that it's not always the whole story, but that there's always more to uncover as families investigate their history, uncover more records, pieces to that story get added.
I know we had some questions over here. Yes. Right.
I have a comment and, okay, so on that end.
Okay. The question is about, of course, some of the ongoing legislation in particular states about what can and can't be taught in the classroom, and how can we, as history educators, really try to encourage the dissemination of these stories and what we've heard today. If anybody has any thoughts about this, and how maybe you do it in your own work.
Well, first of all, I admire you for the space that you guys are in terms of the challenges that are associated with our society today in terms of trying to tell the full story. I think that a lot of it is about telling the story. You know, instead of it being, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're teaching or trying to do is from books, and there's a lot of stuff that's not from books, and you guys are struggling with how do we, you know, stick to the script. But life is about stories. So how can we extract stories through the histories that we're learning about that helps us find ways to kind of spread the curtain back a little bit further? I think that's extremely important. And I think by doing that, it creates more inquisitiveness by our students who perhaps say, hey, you know, I've got stories about my family, or I heard about, and then they've got something to go research, you know, to try to find themselves out. So I come back and just underline, it is about the stories. And I think the more that we can do to pin those stories to our history and help, you know, kind of work in that there's a gap in our history, that it will help us move the ball down the field. That's what I hope.
Julian, do you have a...
I would just build off of what Steve mentioned, which is, even though, you know, not all of these stories are complete and they're in various states at various sites, but even if it's just looking at a house where you know that there was a family living there, but there were also 12 to 15 enslaved people living there. That is a story in and of itself, and just thinking about that, thinking about how a space was populated, constructed, and just kind of using that as a way to start investigating. That information is out there. It's not always from the perspective of the people who were enslaved and without their choice put into these situations, but we do have those records, and that there's truth and power in having those conversations, looking at that.
Right here and then here. Mm-hmm. So the question's for Steve, and it's about how can I, in my classroom, how can I make deeper connections with my students as they're learning about their family history and their ancestors, and how can I do this in the most meaningful way for them?
I have a couple of thoughts on that. You know, the first one is encourage them to think about their own story. Now, I would also say that there are people in our society who don't know their story. You know, for one reason or another, they just don't know. But that doesn't keep them from starting to think about what it is. So I would say perhaps using role models, you know, people who are local historians who may be able to bring some stories there that they can see through this person that they have done X, Y, and Z and how they got there. You've got people like myself who are, you know, can potentially be a role model for students that are thinking about what's going on, and hey, I've been doing this for a long time, and here's the struggles that I have dealt with. So let them see that there's somebody who's ahead of them that hopefully is lifting them up a little bit. And I think the other piece is challenging them to get started. Just ask them what, how I put up that first slide and just had things of what's in their house. What's in their house to kind of describe what's going on, and what do these stories tell you, or what are the stories behind some of those things that might start to create that and light the match, light the fuse that would get them interested in knowing more. That's certainly what it did for me. Thanks for the question.
Next, yes, right here. The question is about the obituary that we saw in Eric's slides about the obituary of Aaron Dupuis, and how common was that for formerly enslaved people to have obituaries, and is that a source for us being able to trace some of these stories that we were talking about today?
I would not regard it as terribly common. I'm sure other enslaved people had obituaries. In fact, this is not the only one that I have. Now, it's the only one that I have that I can say this person was for sure enslaved at Ashland, and I have this family story too. In this case, and in the case of most of the ones I have, I think they were printed more because they were enslaved by Henry Clay than because of the people who were enslaved themselves. Right. And, that's, take that for what it is. It is what it is. But it is worth it that they were printed because they can be useful for tracing family information. In the case of Aaron's, obviously it gives us some important information about who was alive when. I mean, we have some idea from that Charles was dead by 1866. I have no idea why he died or how he died or where he died or where he's buried. I have not found any information on that. The last information I have on him is from the 1850 census. And at that point, he had been free for 6 years and had worked at Ashland for 4 and saved up enough money to bring his family here to the DC area where he was working as a laborer. So what happened between 1850 and 66? I don't know, but at least I have that's a much narrower time frame to search than 1850 to the longest possibility. Mostly with Henry Clay, there are obituaries of enslaved people who are often very elderly. Typically, they are 103 or something. I don't know why. And I don't, how accurate is that? Hard to say. But that's always what they say. That's part of it, too. It's, look how old this person was. Yeah. But they usually then refer back to their early life. For example, we have one for a woman named Clarice Ewing Strauss, who was enslaved by Henry Clay's son, who lived at the next farm over from Ashland, a farm his father bought and built up for him and eventually transferred to him at his death. We know from her obituary that her parents were enslaved by Henry Clay, and it gives their names. I now can look at a journal, a ledger for hemp work that was done on the farm between 1852 and 67 or thereabout, and there is a man with the same name as her father listed breaking hemp during that period. I think that's her father. So we can begin to build a story that way. So what there are very important because they give you points around which to build research and at least some skeleton to work on to build a life. So the fact that we have Aaron's, and Aaron's was published first locally and then all over the country. I have that from papers all over the nation, and they vary somewhat, but they all say the basic same general sets of things. What happened with his family and the fact that what cemetery he was buried in and that he had a headstone. So that gives us a place to start looking. That's why we think we know where he is now, because we know what happened when that cemetery closed.
Can I add to that just a minute? So a couple of things that I would, suggest that maybe you'd look at. Black newspapers. Black newspapers back in the day, they covered the news, whether it was once a week or whether it was a daily, that would be a good place to think about. A lot of people forget about the Federal Writers Project associated with, the work. It was after the Great Depression, the WPA. Thank you very much. The Work Progress is, thank you very much. There was a lot of work there to capture the history of families and things. There was a concerted effort to try to capture that before people disappeared. you know, and a lot of things were poo-pooed about that as well. I mean, I've got something about the Syphaxes in which 1939, a congressman from Wisconsin basically said, how could you talk about the Syphaxes and say that this person is a descendant of Martha Washington? I mean, you know, basically, you know, trying to change history right there in our nation's capital. So the Federalist Writers Project could be a gold mine for allowing students to think about that as well. The other thing that I would say is that, you know, I'm fortunate that the Syphaxes, you know, that being a kind of an odd name, first of all, is easy to kind of research, but the fact that we are connected to the first family and that they have been associated with these historic places, there's been more written about them. And so it makes it a little bit easier. And my goal is to try to use what we learn about this family to extend that to those that are associated with them. So we think about kind of who the neighbors and friends and other family members are, so that we can, in fact, start to uncover some of these other people that have narratives that are just as important. And from that, hopefully find, you know, births and deaths and marriages and the things that we celebrate, you know, in any other way.
Right here. We'll go around. Go ahead.
I was really fascinated by the letter from Nancy Syphax's grandson.
Yeah.
The fact that he was literate.
That's amazing. Well, I don't think he was literate at that time. I think somebody wrote it for him.
Okay.
That's what I think.
And how it was preserved and how you found it.
The fact that it's been preserved and that we've been able to kind of find it. You know, he actually moved with his wife to Washington, D.C. when his grandmother was still alive. He was here for about a year. And then he moved back because his wife didn't like the climate here. They wanted to be back in New Orleans, of all places. I don't know about that. But the fact that we have this letter is just amazing. Now, it's possible that this letter was not a duplicate, but they wrote a letter and then they sent a letter, you know, to Nancy. So it's possible that could be its origins.
So time for, I think, 2 more questions. Right here. The question is for Steve, and it's about moving from, in many African American families, that there's stories or folklore about the descendancy. How did Steve actually go from people telling these stories to actually finding evidence and going from what was considered fiction to fact?
Well, first of all, I would say that I try to, when I think about the folklore piece, I give that as much weight as I give to the other documents that are out there, because it's somebody's truth. Somebody told me their truth about what they have been told, and I respect that. And I put that into my database as a part of all of those things, as well as the other scholarship that's out there. I think that it's difficult at times to try to draw these connections, but it's important to try to look at it from a lot of different angles. It's not just about following the paper trail, because a lot of times the paper trail doesn't exist. So how do we piece this together? By looking at circumstances. One of the other things that I do in looking at my family history is I'm very interested in the circumstances in which people are living in. A real quick example of that is my great-grandfather, Peter Joseph, who was in New Orleans. This is a man who ultimately didn't know how to read and write, fought for the Union Army down there. He ultimately became a presidential elector in the 1876 election. I see your face saying, really? How the heck did I find that? And when I first saw that, I said, get out of here. But I began to look at the various aspects, newspaper articles, all the other documentation. We've got from the Library of Congress the 1876 presidential electors. There's Peter Joseph, his signature's right there. We have the newspaper articles that show that he was elected into that position. So while that is kind of out there more obvious, there are other things that are less obvious that I think it's important to just piece those things together, and I think a story begins to emerge. It's not always easy, but it's there to discover. It really is.
To get one more question here.
It's kind of twofold.
Okay.
That's the way to work into it.
We'll allow it.
There you go.
But thinking of our students, and I think it is so important, the human connection. And
Right.
I honestly, like, my wheels are turning of how am I going to do a project where they start looking at their own families, starting in their own households.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not going back that far, but maybe even to the civil rights era. And that they share their stories collectively in that small classroom community first.
Right.
Is anyone aware of where there's a basic how to start a search? Like when we just say Library of Congress, like to a 14 or 15-year-old. Is there anything out there that has basic tools to search
Well,
family history?
I can, the question is about the tools for searching for basic family history. I had not been at all involved in searching for my family history, mostly because my mother had always said that, you know, the history wasn't very interesting or very distinguished on her side of the family, and that's just what she always said. I never knew my grandmother or my grandfather. One died before I was born. The other one became very sick when I was young, so I wasn't able to gain those stories. So actually where I went more recently, and I am not at all trained in a way to do ancestry, and I'm sure I would find more if I spent more time, but I actually went to the National Archives website, and they have tools at the archives that you can use, and they also have external resources that you can use. And I actually traced my family ancestry through grave sites. And I was shocked to what I found.
There's a lot of it.
Through my maternal grandmother's side. It turns out the story is much more complex than maybe what was even told my mother, and that it goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, which if I had told my mother that, she would have never believed it, because that's not what she was told. And just over the course of spending a few evenings, I did it, and I was shocked. I was like, I'm going to do that again. So I redid the whole exercise, and sure enough, I came up to the same spot to where I started. So I think, you know, the Library of Congress, National Archives, and, you know, there would be other examples here, but it was just provided for me looking, do you want help with ancestry? And there were all these different databases that you could use.
So that is great. I've got a model for you. If you guys are writing things down, here's the model. So start with a very large circle, and then put another circle inside of that, and another circle inside of that. And in the smallest circle, that is what we know. So the place to start is the things that you know. You know that your mom was born in Kansas and your dad was born in Kentucky. You know, start to build it with the things that you know, and you start to realize, you know, what's around the house, like the things I was showing you. So that small circle are the things that we've got, you know, within our fingertips. The bubble outside of that is the things that we know that we don't know. These are the questions that we need to ask. When was mom born? What were mom's parents' names? These are questions that we intuitively think about that we don't know the answers to. So those are the things that we know that we don't know. And we're trying to increase our bubble of what we know to be as large as the bubble of the things that we know that we don't know. Then the larger bubble is the things that we don't know that we don't know. And that bubble, it really starts to enlarge, or the bubble inside of that begin to enlarge as we go down this path by asking questions that, you know, to fill in that I know that I don't know. We begin to ask more questions that start to fill out that other larger bubble. So if you want an exercise for students that could get them started, something like that could be extremely simple before you even get to the website. And then the questions that you ask is, so how would we find that out? Maybe the archives have something. Maybe the Library of Congress. Maybe the local newspaper.
And census documents were just released
Census
for
document,
1950, and
right.
they're all digitized and they're all scanned. So you can, you know, I went and found my parents in the 50 census,
Right.
which was really, you know, interesting to see that, and that can be another starting point.
Yeah, your library may have something, your local historical society. There may be workshops that are a little bit focused on how to do an oral history or how to start down that path. So
Local Historical Society.
Yeah.
If you reach out to people, even at national institutions, I know when I worked at the Library of Congress, our most popular inquiries came from people researching genealogy and ancestry. So there was a very helpful guide that was produced, but also we had specialists, librarians who just specialize in genealogy and ancestry, and they fielded questions all day long, not just in person, but virtually from students, from teachers, from just curious Americans looking for more information about their families. So, you may not get an answer, an hour from now, but but several days, and they really are responsive, and archivists and librarians are there to help you, and they want to unlock these treasures for you and your students.
I enjoy getting those kinds of inquiries, and I get them pretty regularly. I mean, we're not primarily there as a research institution. We are there as an interpretive and exhibition institution, but I can direct people to the kinds of resources that I have used, and there are lots of them even locally. So I would submit local museums, libraries, and archives. That's what they're there for. So by all means, take advantage of those resources.
Well, thank you very much for a tremendous conversation this morning. Will you join me in thanking our guests for all the stories? And we once again want to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation, who supported us first in doing this work, in the interpretive work that was done, and then also for helping to support actually the 3 members of our Decatur Advisory Board Council for being here and joining us, and also filming this for future teachers to be able to watch. So thank you to the National Trust as well.